We learned a lot about crucial features of Angular already. Let's also learn how we can handle user input. And for that, in my persons folder, I'll create a new component, which I'll name person-input.component.ts. And we export a class in there. And just as before, I'll name this person input component using Pascal case notation. And to turn this into a component we can use, I will add component here, imported from @Angular core. We pass a JavaScript object to that decorator, and now we can configure that component. And just as before, we want to add a selector. App person-input, for example, makes sense here. And you can see how naming works, I guess. You have kebab case here, which means you separate words with dashes. Pascal case here, which means you have one big word, but every sub-word starts with a capital character. Now, we don't just need a selector, we also want to have a template. You can also define a template in a string inside of this file, but I always use external files, which is also recommended. And I will point at a person-input.component.html file, which doesn't exist yet, so let's create it. person-input.component.html. Now, just as before, to be able to use this component, we need to register it, and we'll do so in the app module. So here in declarations, I want to add my person input component, and here my IDE automatically added this import. You need to add this on your own if your IDE doesn't do that. Make sure you are importing person input component from that respective file and add it here to declarations so that you can use its selector in your templates. Now, with that added, let's say I want to render it above my list of persons. So here I'll add app person input like that. Now, of course, my template is pretty empty right now. It's an empty HTML file. And to make that more interesting here, I'll actually add an input element of type text and maybe a label in front of it where I say it should be for the name. Name like this. Let's give this an ID of name and save that. Now, if you go back, you should see that input and that label next to it. Now, styling isn't beautiful. You can add your own styles, of course. I want to focus on the core logic and not so much on CSS. Now, I don't just want to have the input and the label. I also want to have a button here where I say create. And to have some styling now, at least, I'll add a person-input.component.css. And I just add a styling for label, input, and button. And I'll all give them a display block property to make sure they all span into new lines. Now we just need to point at that CSS file and register it as a styling file for this component. And that is done by adding style URLs in the configuration of this component, so of the person input component. Now, important, this takes an array of paths because you could have more than one file. You can only have one template, but you can have multiple styling files. And here I'll point at person-input.component.css. And now if I save this, you see we have 3 lines and we have the button here at the bottom. Now, that is all nice and beautiful, but now, of course, I want to make sure that when I hit that button, and I just zoomed in, didn't change the styling, just zoomed in a bit more. When I hit that button, I want to add whatever I entered here as a new element. Now, how can we do that?